Good evening and welcome to our webinar, Data Centre Update. I'm Chris McLaughlin, Secretary, Ireland Network. I also wish to extend a very warm welcome to members of Engineers Ireland who are joining with us this evening. Getting back to tonight, our speaker is Gary Connolly, President and founder of Host in Ireland. Host in Ireland is a strategic global initiative created to increase awareness of the benefits of hosting digital assets in Ireland. Gary is a much sought after keynote speaker, panelist and moderator at global industry events. Gary regularly appears in conferences throughout the Americas, Asia and Europe, to name but a few. Gary has over 30 years experience in assisting foreign direct investment in Europe and was recognised as one of the top 50 EMEA influencers in Cloud and Data Centres 2017 by Data Economy. It is a privilege to have him address us this evening, and I invite Gary to make his presentation.
Thank you so much, Chris. I'm delighted to be here, actually. It's very interesting when you listen to somebody like yourself telling people who I am and what I do. I often think it's somebody else that you're talking about. The reality is that 30 years of talking common sense, I think, and now the opportunity to present to this audience is so important that more than anything that we present the why data, the why Ireland, the why then subsequently feeds into the how, which is the centres. So what I've tried to do this evening is give you a picture, and the listeners and the audience a sense of how we've evolved to the state where people can obviously say rightly that Ireland is a tier 1 data hosting location. Host in Ireland, as you've rightly identified, it's actually a co-opetition is what we call it. It's a coming together of the biggest and the best in many different sectors, from the hosting companies to the design, the build, the operational side, and working together. So really what we look for the companies to do is in many respects park their own egos, park their own balance sheets, park their own short-term objectives to work with each other, as you rightly identified, for two fundamental reasons. One is to attract data to Ireland, because if we can demonstrate that we're an optimum place for data to rest, data to be hosted from, then obviously you need centres. But of late, and many of the listeners are probably aware, Ireland has a tremendous reputation now globally for the design and build of the centres themselves. So I'm not sure that there's any place in Europe, certainly, and maybe even further afield, where you won't find Irish contractors who are designing, building and even operating centres. But the fundamental core is that it's a co-opetition. Well, I've asked two colleagues, Host in Ireland partners and Executive Council members to join me this evening to break out the talk into three distinct components. As I say, I'm going to try and give you a good sense of why Ireland, etc. David McCauley, who's CEO of BitPower, is then going to give the people on this call actually a week early a snapshot of Ireland's current size, scale, growth, and all. One of the things that you will be hearing this audience for the very first time is we're now addressing, because we have demonstrable evidence of the size of the carbon associated with the data center industry, both now, short term and longer term. And then I've asked Alan to come at the end. Alan comes and he's great because he's got two sides of the coin. Having worked for EirGrid and having worked for Semi-State, he's got a wonderful insight into that side. And he also then has, when he's in his current role with Kirby's, he's able to see it from the operator's perspective. So Alan will join us, not in a formal way, but at the Q&A side at the end. So my side will take about 20 minutes, Dave, about 10, which should leave sufficient time for as much Q&A as we can possibly get. It's the bit I enjoy the most, and I hope people will stay on board to actually ask informed questions. So fundamentally, where are we in the world's evolution? Well, when it comes to innovation and technology, we're in the fourth industrial revolution. Well, the fourth industrial revolution, as defined by the Economic Forum or the World Economic Forum, is the period of time where data is actually the relevant asset that is driving the innovation and the cycle of change. Effectively, if you look at the four different industrial revolutions that went previously, the data of today is the equivalent of what created the first industrial revolution, or steam. So that's effectively where we are in the overall cycle. Everything as we move forward is being driven, monitored, managed, or changed due to the availability of timely and accurate data. There's two aspects to everything, and change will always have a yin and a yang. So when you look at, there's many people who are really encouraged and excited about this, that data is such an influencing asset. And when you look at things like holographic MRIs that are taken by a specialist in Japan that's looking at a subsection of somebody's brain in Dublin, it really is, and it can be seen as part of the weapon of mass invention. And there's no doubt about that there's great things evolving in AI, etc., that is advantageous to us all. But there's also the other side of it, where because we're giving people effectively a supercomputer of what would have been equivalent to a supercomputer, or up to 10,000 times more power and compute than put man on the moon only 50 odd years ago, it also can be seen as a weapon of mass distraction, is what I call it. You know, it's taken us away from the things that maybe that we'd missed or we have been missing. Maybe it's coming back slightly with where we found ourselves now. But certainly data is the kernel and the core of what your smart devices are using. Without a smart device, you can't generate the data, obviously. And everywhere you've got smart in front, you've got a data center behind. That's the one thing to take away. None of these things get their smarts, or none of these things really get their intelligence, except there's a data center behind. You can love it, you can love it less. But the one thing to be sure of is that you're already using such an amount, and I'll get on to the more that we're using now that we're finding ourselves working from home, etc. But there's so many things. Everybody talks about autonomous cars and autonomy and autonomous transport and stuff. But you know, even the simple things of maps, you're already using so much data. You're already using so many algorithms, whether it's Spotify, whether it's Maps, whether it's all the apps that you've got on your actual smart device, even before you bring it to a business environment. In fact, you know, when you think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, he looked at 40 million years of evolution, and he saw that there's 5 basic hierarchy of needs. And it's all about keeping people fed, warm, feeling that they're part of a society, etc. Now, we all find ourselves in a very strange situation where we're spending an awful lot more time with our children, irrespective of their age. And my sense is, like, you keep all those things for them, and they still wouldn't be as overly as affected as if the Wi-Fi and the battery wasn't working. So I think we're fundamentally, and it's not just teenage kids, it's not even young children, it's all of us now, that our hierarchy in needs, particularly now as we find ourselves in where we're working remotely, or we're educating ourselves remotely, or in entertaining ourselves completely remotely, is Wi-Fi and battery are such part of the fundamental fabric of who and what we are. And the children now at this stage, I'm sure many of you have young children, boys and girls, using Fortnite. You know, they're looking at online games. They're looking at the money that these dudes are making. I mean, 3 million was the largest single event last year that the guy won the Fortnite World Champion. Look at the right hand side of the slide. You know, it morphs or eclipses winning Wimbledon, winning one of the Opens. So, you know, this is very much part of the fundamental fabric before COVID, and I'll get on to that in a moment. But so effectively, what is the Industrial Revolution? We said that it's driven by data, but the data is created by devices or connected equipment. I said smart, anywhere you've got smart car, smart device, smart phone, smart thermostat, you've got a data center behind. But when you look at the fundamental numbers of devices that are being designed, built, and actually been ingested into all parts of our world. Every one of them is creating data. And we went well past in about 2010 the number of devices in the world to the humans. This year we're going to pass the 50 billion. And when you look forward only one decade, it's a trillion devices. To put some context on that, I had a slide earlier about smart cars. A smart car is going to have about 2,000 smart devices, because the whole fundamentals of something like an autonomous vehicle is that it's autonomous. It doesn't have to be connected to anything. The data that's creating is equivalent per minute to a short flight in Europe, data-wise, and per hour is equivalent to a transatlantic flight. So you're going to have every device up to 300 million devices, and that's only the cars. So it's all about the devices that are becoming smart, that are creating data, which is creating more data, and it's all part of the interconnectedness. And you think, oh, Jeannie Mac, that's ridiculous. How could we get to 1 trillion devices? Well, look at this simple device. Again, if any of you are part of, or any of your children are part of Coda Dojo, this is sort of the stable diet of the Arduino and the Raspberry Pis. They're small devices. They are probably 10 to 20 to 30,000 times more powerful, as I say, than what put man on the moon. They're used up and down the coding clubs. So, and they're called a Raspberry Pi. So you've got one of those dudes on the left. Look at all that power. Look at all that connectivity. Look at all those options. And on the right-hand side, you've got a normal Raspberry Pi. You get an Avoca or somewhere like that. The Raspberry Pi is actually more expensive. So that's why we're going to get to the stage where you've got homemade equipment that's more powerful, connecting to other equipment, always generating data. And all this data has to go somewhere. To give you some quantums, we're at the stage now where we can start to see what's called a zettabyte of data, 10 to the power of 10 to the power of 10, I think. To give you a sense of how much that is, a byte of data was a grain of rice. Each zettabyte is the Pacific Ocean. So we're at the stage where we're generating currently this year, pre-COVID, end of February, in the region of 27 to 37 zettabytes of data this year. That's a lot of rice. That's a lot of stuff that needs to be stored. It's a lot of rice that needs to be anticipated. If all the rice was the same, you'd have one challenge, but it's not. It's Amazon AWS. It's legacy data, it's COBOL, it's on-site, it's off-site, it's in the cloud, it's in the edge. That's the challenge, this mass accumulation of data from all those billions of devices. And what a center does is brings it together into a geographic location. One of the things I'm often asked about is, why is there really only 7 what is classified in the world as hyperscales? And why are they so dominant? Well, there's obviously reasons of marketing and power and finances, etc. But fundamentally, AWS by Amazon, Azure by Microsoft, and Google Platform by Google are the platforms that all the other applications build on. All the ones I've mentioned earlier, Airbnb, Netflix, Uber, Spotify, name any of those apps, they all are on Amazon or Microsoft or Google. If you look at APAC, you've also got then their competitors, which will be Alibaba, Baidu, Tencent. They're effectively the 6. And then you've got hyperscale, they're the 6 dominant hyperscales. Then just down from them, you may have other hyperscales, but not quite hyperscales, because most of the stuff that they're developing is for themselves. You've Facebook, and you have Apple. And I'll show you a slide in a moment. The quantums between those 8, let's say, and the rest is huge. And that's why, so when I'm asked, sort of, why don't we get Netflix? Why don't we get Dropbox? Why don't we get Airbnb? Why don't we have them in Ireland? They're just in one of the platforms. Because these platforms are like Dundrum Shopping Centre. They basically own the whole building, and then they sublet different parts of it. So as you can see, Amazon, Google, Microsoft, this is only the Europe, and the size of the market, 6 billion per quarter. In my experience, and I'm older than some and not as old as others, I don't think there's ever been an infrastructure build out, except maybe oil and gas, of this quantum. 30 billion per quarter. 30 billion quid is being spent on Amazon, Google, Microsoft, hyperscales, and also the co-location and managed services. This is before you get to the ICT equipment that's sitting in the racks. This is just the basic shell, the connectivity, and etc. So you're looking at pre the acceleration brought about by COVID, you're looking at 30 billion per quarter. In Ireland, Dave will talk about it, we're on a run rate of about 1.3 billion, so around about 1% of the global market. Share price of these companies, I mean, these are the trillion-dollar companies that you hear about. Throw in these three, plus throw in then Apple, you know, market caps, not sure, I haven't looked recently, but they're probably still around the 800-900 billion mark. Look at the year-on-year growth. Now, this is for quarter just gone, so this is up to the end of March, before the COVID effect. So then we come and we have the COVID. So what has COVID done effectively to the data marketplace? Well, we're having this call on a Zoom video conference, creating more data, creating more traffic, creating more usage for data centers and its supporting infrastructure. When you multiply that then by all the other applications that are distributed, you've basically seen an acceleration of the industrial revolution curve. Look at this video.
Since the beginning of the COVID-19 crisis, your physical world has gotten smaller. You're staying safe by staying in, but your online world has expanded.
Most of you are working at home now. Your kids have been educated online. You're banking online. You're talking to friends and family online. Every aspect of your life has changed.
Now we are looking to data centres more in the current situation to provide our livelihoods, to be able to provide for our families, and to build a community bond in the current social distancing situation we all find ourselves in. Every single YouTube video, Netflix film, or Zoom meeting that you might participate in go through servers that are housed in purpose-built facilities just like this.
This data centre was built to make sure, no matter what happens, storms, power cuts, or even a global pandemic, your world stays connected.
Connected to grandparents, parents, health workers, teachers, friends, colleagues, the people who really matter to you. We are the digital frontline. But the true heroes are, of course, the healthcare workers all around Ireland. They have our unending thanks for the long hours, personal risk, and a commitment to our community. Each and every day of them is demonstrated.
So I'm not sure that we're going to win any Oscars for the video footage, but I think it gives you a sense that whilst there is a healthcare front line, and rightly so, there's also a digital front line that these essential workers in Ireland have been providing services for all of the home services and all of the new norm services that we have. Zoom has become a verb. And you know, you talk to people who would never, even Chris and in advance of this call, we were chatting, and it's become so natural now to have Zoom calls to your work, to your private, to your cousins and everyone all over the world. It's become a verb. It's just a part of who we are now. And let's look at some of the traffic numbers. The traffic numbers, Akamai are effectively a content delivery company, and they measure what's going on around the world. So effectively, as you can see there, he's seen never anything like the traffic increases. And it's not that it's the growth, it's the distribution of it. And we have it everywhere now, right to the edge. We were waiting for sort of, when would the edge become a reality? Well, it's become a reality now that every home is connected to work, play, and indeed educate. If you look at also then, which is probably a more indicative number, what we have seen with COVID is that it has been the ultimate opportunity for organizations and data centers to stress test their business continuity plans. Because now we have situations where, and I'm assuming that a lot of the audience are more on the mechanical, electrical, and technical rather than the data, but there's the cloud, which is the public stuff, that is Amazon, Google, Microsoft. There's on-premise, which is your kit that you have in your racks in your offices. And then there's this hybrid world, which is more like a co-location, where people are moving one way out or into the other. And when your data center dudes are being classified as essential workers, like the guys in the video before, but your IT guys aren't essential workers, it's a problem, because you still have to maintain the same level of service to your organization, but they just happen to be at home, not in their office. So it has accelerated that whole digitalization of moving equipment to more virtual cloud environments, whether they be private, in a co-location, a hybrid, in a co-location, or the public cloud. And I think this is actually the real crux of what's accelerating. 2 years. Most countries, 30%, some countries higher. Some applications that Amazon and Google and Microsoft are using, like Teams or Zoom, that have seen 700, 800% increases just overnight nearly. I showed you this earlier. It was basically the World Economic Forum and IDC showing the acceleration of the number of devices creating data, smart devices. I've crudely sort of butchered it slightly, but really what's happened is we've just, in this year alone, or really in this quarter between mid-February and today, probably 8 weeks or so, we have effectively taken, as the Microsoft lad said, 2 years of devices, 2 years of data, 2 years. And we're also already in an Irish context, projects that were to start, that are planned on master plans with full planning, etc., that were to start, say, Q1 in 2022, are already coming onto the table. They're already coming to be, we need now, we've used some of our capacity that we had, and we need now to start bringing them forward by 8 to 12 quarters in some cases. Ireland. So effectively what I've tried to do, I might have gone on a little bit longer than I expected, but that's the context of data. That's the context of the amount of data. That's the context of where it's coming from. Ireland, we started on this journey 60 years ago. So if you have an IT background, you'll empathize with this. We had mainframes, we had mini computers, personal computers, we networked them all. And then we decided that we'd go back to a mainframe. No, sorry, I'm only joking. We go to the cloud. But the cloud effectively demonstrates that centralization, whether it's private cloud, public cloud, or actually hybrid cloud. So they are recognized as the 5 waves of IT over the last 60 years. Ireland, from 1956, when IBM came here for the first, they came here, they needed a launch pad for Europe. They set up in the Shelbourne Hotel, actually. They used that for office initially. Those people then left, or they brought in new students, or they brought in foreign direct investment workers. They set up DEC, Amdahl, etc. And every time that there's been a wave of change, Ireland has been in a position to be there to benefit from the legacy knowledge that we had, from the mainframe to the mini, to the computers, to the network computers, and now the cloud. A lot of the synergies, and you'd recognize many of the names. Unfortunately, some of us remember them all, which goes back to the 70s and the 80s. In fact, it was really interesting, just right in the middle of the close down, just before, we were about to celebrate 20 years of Ireland being recognized as the largest exporter in the world. Interesting, because in 2000 there wasn't any cloud, it was all floppy disks. So it gives you a sense of the legacy and the pedigree that Ireland has with data. The data that was being burned onto the Oracle disks or the Microsoft disks and being exported via floppy disks and 40-foot containers on trucks and transportation to Europe. Ireland was the largest, bar none. As I say, the OECD recognized that in March of 2000. So how do we stay in the game? Well, we got really, really active on building the virtual transport systems, and that's fiber optic cables. Fiber optic cables to the mainland market, the 500 million, whatever it is now post-Brexit, that's Ireland's market. Same way as in 2000, the floppy disks were going to Europe. Now the fiber links us via the UK, and also on the left-hand side, circumnavigating the UK, and underneath now some of the new planned fibers to be able to deliver the products and services in the Irish data centers virtually to the market, which is Europe. This now you'll start to get a sense as to why the Metro Dublin is so important. When all these cables started to be terminated and the internet exchanges started to be interconnected, it was around about the time of the M50. And somebody, in fairness, had an idea. Why are we building an M50, which is for motorways? Why don't we have a parallel T50? And a T50 is trunking 50. That's it in a nutshell. It's 40 unique chambers and ducts that circumnavigate the city, because obviously you can't have a straight line, break a fiber, you need an alternative route. So that's why you'll then start to see this unique chamber ducting system called the T50, and then you see why the fiber optics all come to the end markets, whether they're going to the, and Europe is the main market, not America's. Europe is the main market where they terminate, and there's where the fibers are. Now we're starting to see, because some of the proximity zones are allowing for it now between the interoperability between, we're starting to see some stuff just south of Drogheda, Facebook, just across the border. Not yet seen any occupation, but some activity going into Wicklow, and we'll probably see in not too distant future some stuff in Kildare. But effectively, because these guys are not isolated pieces of data from Amazon to Google to Microsoft to Digital Realty to Dataplex to Keppel, the data is always interoperating. So therefore, even when they have to go down to a geographic location in the country, it's right now, currently, unless it's subvented energy or something like that, which Ireland doesn't give, rightly so, it's going to be in the greater Metro Dublin. And when we're selling Ireland, it's the Metro Dublin, and even though it includes part of Meath, part of Kildare to come, and part of Wicklow. And they're just the transport, that's for the market. So what is it? Just big sheds using renewable energy, or is actually something inside these things benefiting Ireland? Well, the reality is that the products and services that are in the data centers are actually Ireland's largest soft services export at nearly, what is $680 odd billion. This is 2018. The products and services that go out the fiber, same way as the floppy disks did back in the 20 years ago, are monetized. They're very much products and services that are coming in. Right now, with all traditional factories closed, the only factories, bar none, that are still operating fully, if not higher, are the digital factories. So data centers today, none of them have been closed, none of them have been curtailed. The workers are seen as essential workers. And in fact, the revenue that's coming in from the sale of the products that are in the centers is up, obviously due to the demand increases that we've already mentioned. And so in summary, data is constantly going through an evolution. We've seen different mediums, punch cards even, way back, floppy disks, CD-ROMs, the cloud, and now the final one, which is the IoT. IoT is the Internet of Everything, or Internet of Things, which is fundamentally the Industrial Revolution 4.0. So it's an evolution. Ireland's relationship with that is really strong. The same people that built Microsoft and Sandyford in the 80s and 90s were the people that decided on the data center in Grange Castle. Those people left, some of them, and they set up Google because they did pedigree. So this is something that the data is the magic. The center is only a byproduct. The value of the data is, as we say, 80 to 90 billion. And now, to stay in that game, to remain as a tier one, Ireland is going to have to be so brave, so creative, and so relentless in its pursuit of decarbonizing the grid. Because there is no such thing as a desire by a data company right now of the big leading companies to be anything but green data. You know, you have Microsoft, they're setting a neutral status. This is their stock and trade. They're going after the big money, which is the trillions of dollars that are looking for sustainable assets to invest in. that really now is the opportunity with the demand that we've got, which Dave will go through now in a moment. They're basically the covenants needed to go to the Irish wind energy or the solar or the offshore to give them the 20 to 25 years of takeoffs to allow them to build the actual renewable energy. But unless that will be, you know, and there's an awful lot of talk about data centers, this, that, and the other, there is no desire for Ireland, and I certainly wouldn't be interested in attracting anything other than data center operators that want to use renewable energy. We have to be able to deliver it. So with that, that's just the context to allow Dave to come in and talk a little bit about, as I say, in a week in advance, the current status, the size, the scale, and the overheads and the growth of the data center industry in Ireland right now. So Dave, if you want to take over the screen, you're very welcome to.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you very much, Gary. Insightful as always. It's a pleasure to speak to you this evening. Always a risk when you have young children that one of them will burst in the door at some point. So if you hear screaming, it is about bedtime, so we should be okay. So to give you a sense of where I picked this up from, I come from an energy background, and 3 or 4 years ago, I started looking at the data industry, trying to figure out how big is it and what is it, and is it a big energy user? And to that effect, we worked for Hosts in Ireland to produce a, I'm just doing a bit of screen share here. Okay, so we started to analyze the data industry in 2017, and we pulled together a report whereby we measured all of the data centers in Ireland. I think at the time we identified about 40 or 50, about 40 data centers of different sizes. And we calculated the CO2, and we measured everything we could to do with those data centers. Who would have thought it could have grown? Every quarter now we do an analysis, and we publish with Hosts in Ireland all this data, and we do a dashboard, and we deliver that, as I say, every quarter, and it's been quite insightful for us. But one thing I learned, and Gary touched on it earlier, the idea that Netflix and these companies exist across the data centers. What I had found was Amazon, Microsoft, and Facebook, and I couldn't find any of the other guys. But when we dig into it, what we call the hyperscales here, Amazon, Facebook, Google, and Microsoft. But there are other players in the market here. And what we're seeing is these guys host everything. And sorry, now my screen is, okay, so what we also have in the industry are entities called co-location data centers. There's the likes of Black Knight and Planet 21. If you do a speed test on your phone, you'll find you're connected to one of these. And then there's other entities like EdgeConneX, Echelon, etc., that are building for the hyperscales. So I suppose terminology, we call those hyperscales, and we call these colo or colo wholesale, or maybe even private data centers. And what we do find in Ireland, and I think across Europe, is that, you know, almost 80% of what's built in terms of megawatts is hyperscale. And the rest is made up of wholesale and co-location. And we're seeing this in markets really everywhere, that those 4 or 5 big players are really own the capacity, and everything goes through those. So when we pull it all together, this is what we get. So this is the quarterly dashboard that we produce, and the numbers across the top, I suppose, give a sense of the megawatts. So I think in terms of energy. So we talk about 708 megawatts there across 60 data centers in this quarter. 280, that's 12 new data centers actually in construction at the moment. 26 with planning permission, totaling 620 megawatts. Another 9 in the planning process at some point. And then others that we hear about that we call master plan. They could be rumors, they could be dotted lines on a plan or something. But when we zoom in, let me just show you the map. So we basically mapped them at a high enough level. Now, obviously we know where every data center is. And And this is how we build our model. We literally identify each building and measure it in order to calculate and apply some metrics to figure out how many megawatts that data center is. The industry is relatively secretive. So although the co-location operators through Hosted Ireland were able to give us a lot of information, the big players, Google and Microsoft and Amazon, they're like, it's a nice idea, but we can't share that information. So we found a methodology by using industry metrics to multiply out the size of the building, and you get really good at going into Google Maps and knowing what a data center looks like. And certainly over the past couple of years, I've seen the evolution of different styles of data center, and certainly one trend that we're seeing is growth in terms of scale of those data centers, and they're becoming more kind of homogenous. They're more consistent looking. Just as Gary mentioned earlier, we step out and look at the kind of clusters. So that map gave us our kind of key areas in and around Ballycoolan, Grange Castle, Clonshock, Tala, and they'd be the kind of 5 main clusters around Dublin. But we can zoom out a little bit and see that it is evolving, and we're, like Gary mentioned, Dundalk and Arklow, with additional pretty large data centers, and we're starting to see a little bit of a spread out of Dublin beyond that kind of T50 network. So I suppose the question is the latency there? My understanding is up to 60 kilometers or so, which is your distance to Arklow, is perfectly fine for a round trip signal to go back and forth to 2 data centers. So I think some of those locations are becoming more attractive with grid constraints, etc., in the Dublin area. Very quickly, and I won't share this in much detail, but we have done a similar exercise across Europe, and just to give you a sense of what's built, and this is not a comprehensive analysis as yet, but you hear about cities like Frankfurt, London, Amsterdam, and Paris being the flap cities. Dublin, even bigger again, and some of the other cities where the hyperscales are going, such as Stockholm, Hamina and Luleå, for instance, in the Nordics. And they're seeing a lot of hyperscale development. And just in terms of what is actually to be built, Stockholm, there's huge plans for Stockholm. I think it was Google announced a $1 billion investment in Poland, Bilbao in Spain, and Madrid. So there's huge investment still happening. Dublin still has a lot in its pipeline. Again, these aren't comprehensive because it's really a model that we're building up. So just going back to the dashboard, one of the key things we pick up on, and particularly with COVID, I suppose, is the area of investment in data centers. So we try to figure out, well, what is the amount of spend on data centers? And there's some metrics you can use. Basically, the data centers cost 7 to 8 million euros per megawatt of IT power. So we apply that into our model, into the IT part of our model, and multiply it out, projecting what we think will be built. And that's where we get the number of 1.3 billion expected to be spent each year for the next 5 years. Now on 2020 there, you can see a little dip for the COVID effect. I think what we're finding there is that there's probably a quarter of lost construction, maybe less than a quarter, but we probably average it out as a quarter. But not 100% of that investment is lost, because 60% of the investment is for equipment that has to get ordered, get shipped. It could be sitting on site awaiting workers to return to install it. So we actually think the effect so far on the data industry will be around 10 to 15%. So we reckon there's probably 200 million of investment that will either be condensed later on this year or pop up somewhere further down the line, depending on the capacity of the construction industry to absorb it. Plus, as Gary said, if some of the bigger facilities that were planned for 2 or 3 years' time are getting moved forward, then I think that 200 million will become insignificant pretty quickly. Okay, so that's our dashboard. So this year, or this quarter, we decided to have a closer inspection on the CO2 impact of data centers. You probably will have come across numbers from EirGrid, for instance, that say 30% of our electricity demand will be for data centers. So we're trying to get our head around these numbers. So really what we do is we take a look at the projected data center growth going forward to 2025, for argument's sake. So we're saying in 2019 there was just over 650 megawatts constructed at the end of the year, and we project our numbers forward for each facility into the future. So it's kind of an upward trend, and it's almost it's gone up faster than it used to, if you get my meaning. And then we plug in all our numbers and we figure out, well, looking backwards, what was the CO2 from the electricity grid related to data centers, and it's in around the 1.5%, which is a lot lower than we would have thought, given the talk of 25 to 30%. But when we work out the CO2, obviously electricity is cleaner and becoming greener and greener. So this is our kind of net feeling that going forward, even with the growth of the data industry, you've got this leveling off trend of CO2. So it's kind of hitting below 2.5% somewhere. As the electricity grid becomes greener. And just to give you a sense for the techies, how we get that, SEAI obviously produce annual statistics on the carbon intensity of the grid, so we plug those numbers in. We were quite encouraged by the quite low intensity, the newer numbers that were released only this week from SEAI, that brought the CO2 down from where we had been last year, 375 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour, down to 331. So we thought that's very interesting. So what does the 70 by 30 projection for renewables mean? What does it mean if we have 70% renewable electricity? And the IWEA the Wind Energy Association did a study in 2018, I think it was, with Baringa. And their numbers really projected that by 2030, the CO2 intensity of electricity will be down to 100 grams per kilowatt hour. So projecting that down in a linear fashion, we're reckoning it's heading down to 150 by 2025, which is kind of the scope of our model. So we plug that in. We also give credit to the total amount of CO2, which includes agriculture and all other transport and everything else. And we give credit to that. So we kind of bring down the total CO2 number. We assume that will come down because of the greening of electricity. And these are kind of taken from EPA figures and SEAI numbers. And what that gives us, it means we're comparing against this total CO2 reducing going forward. So you would expect the effect there would be for the CO2 effect of the data centers to increase. But again, as we show, it's kind of leveling off. So certainly renewables, data centers are keen to do whatever they can do to encourage and buy more renewables. We don't at any point here claim credit for power purchase agreements. We don't make any assumptions about that. We don't talk about ETS, non-ETS. We kind of just assume everybody gets the same electricity, and we count that CO2. But the numbers are quite encouraging. If the grid can continue to absorb such amounts of wind, and there's some interesting work going on about taking some of the assets that data centers have, such as UPS systems, for instance, and using those to help provide more grid inertia, thereby allowing the grid to take on more wind and to not curtail wind so much. So I think the future's bright, and I also think that's possibly my last slide. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks to both Gary and David for providing an excellent presentation. I'd now like to invite Alan McHugh to host the question and answer session.
Alan here. Yeah, I can certainly get the questions going. Again, just to echo the sentiments of David there on Gary's presentation, and also to add that Dave's himself was as usual, very interesting and full of informative facts and figures, which I don't get tired of hearing, to be honest with you. I suppose one question, just maybe to get things moving along, would be noting that there's a lot of really good stuff in all the facts, the figures, the graphs, the information that Gary and Dave have presented. is there a proper grasp held by, maybe in one sense, the general public, but also the powers that be, the authorities, the decision makers, of essentially all of that positivity that's been set out there in front of us this evening? The levels of investment, the value of that to the economy, the strength and resilience of it in the context of COVID that's playing out at the moment, and the future opportunities. So we're talking about Dave's presentation, a lot of talk of the future into 2030 and where everything's going, the greening of the economy generally, the greening of the electricity market and the data market. Is it properly understood, do we think?
I think anything that you can't see, touch and feel always has a challenge. Back in March of 2000, there was nearly a national day of celebration among certain sectors when Ireland was recognised as the largest exporter of floppy disks. Because we could see it, we could feel it. There was 1,800 people working in Microsoft out in Sandyford. But guess what? Now Microsoft have over 3,500 people working in Ireland. So I think that one of the things that people often think is that these are very large sheds. They don't do an awful lot. And a lot of people concentrate then on the capacity of electricity as distinct to what Dave is talking about is the carbon related to it. When we talk to policy people, I think it's best, for the purpose of this, in case there's a lot of people on the call that might be in that fraternity, but one of the things I'm often asked, not just in Ireland, globally, is we need and want to be very careful about these data centers because we think they're going to be replaced by the cloud. And I think that if you don't get that, then we need to have a different discussion. It's all about the value of data. And foreign direct investment in Ireland now is what, 300,000 people, average pay of 70,000. The data that they have in the centres is a business unit part of their overall. And to answer your question, I don't think the people, because they can't see it fully, I don't think the hyperscales do themselves any favours either. It's rare you see them out playing. You see the co-location and managed services guys. But I think that the minute that the data center people recently were giving essential worker status, something happened. I was on the radio News Talk, and usually when I go on News Talk, the first question is, you should be ashamed of yourself, nearly. 30%, this, that, and the other. Whereas the dude basically said to me, he says, well, if it wasn't for data centers right now, we wouldn't be transmitting this show. So the mood music slightly changed. Whether that will continue or not, I think it will and only should in Ireland, to be honest, Alan, if we can be part of the decarbonised green data story. That's the key. As a citizen of Ireland, as Host in Ireland president, that's what we're driving towards. So I think, yes, I think there's a more appreciation for it. I don't think people realize 80 billion of software and products gets exported from the centres. And only time will tell whether people start looking at renewable energy in Ireland as an asset. Because we've 75,000, and I read this from the Irish Oireachtas Committee recently, and they said there's 75,000 megawatts of renewable energy as an asset to Ireland. Now, what are we going to do with it? It's quite extraordinary when you look at it like that. If it was gold and diamonds, I'd say to be digging up every single hill in the country. Here's an opportunity to take that energy or electricity and use it as a feeder stock for another product called data and export it as a value to the economy. So I think it's still confusing. I think the work that Dave is doing at the moment, there's a lot of reports that are very unhelpful because they feed a different narrative. But I think that if we can start to demonstrate that the greening of the grid and the growth of data centers, guess what? There hasn't been, if there is a good news story, I think, and I'll ask this back to you, Alan, if there is a good news story over the last number of, say, 10 years, in Ireland of decarbonisation, the closest thing you can get to a good news story is the decarbonisation of the electricity grid. Would you agree?
I would. Yeah, I mean, Ireland for a long time has been held up as a world leader in many ways in terms of integration of renewables, and continues to do so. We're always up there, thereabouts, in the tables, the European tables of who's leading the charge. Yeah, certainly it strikes me as being the fact that we've made so many inroads in that industry. And then we've talked about, I suppose, the success story of the data industry in Ireland, that it seems to be, you know, it almost like it's a too good to be true story, nearly, the merging of the two together, and the opportunity that you can see within that if you hit that sweet spot of riding the renewable integration wave, if you want to call it that, and the data development, data hosting wave that Ireland has, there's just serious opportunity there from a technical to an economic, social, environmental opportunity. It just ticks so many boxes.
And Dave obviously was talking recently, Dave McCauley was talking also, these projections that we're doing and Dave is doing are based on today's technologies. So as many people always say, we always overestimate what we can achieve in 2 years and underestimate what we can achieve in 10. You know, there's an awful lot of work still on the likes of green hydrogen gas. I mean, you know, and that's starting now, I understand from speaking to Dave, and biogas and all these types of stuff. We're talking about today's technologies and the participation of the data centers for helping the inertia of the grid and stuff. There's technical challenges, but maybe I'm just too long being the fella who wants to chase the opportunity. But where there's change, there's opportunity. There's going to be opportunities that we quite don't have the answers for now. But if we could all align ourselves into understanding that data as an asset isn't something that's going to go out of fashion in 3 years. It's just not. You know, so therefore understand the asset class of data in our daily lives, why we use it, how we use it, and then say, okay, so if we were to invest in a infrastructure to feed into green electrons, to create green data, understand that that's a value, and then we export it. I mean, you work for a company called Kirby's. I'm not sure, I'll throw it out there, but I'd say you've got as many fellas working around Europe on data centers as you have working on data centers in Ireland.
Yeah, it's true. Roundabout now, we're kind of tipping that balance there with as much work outside of Ireland as we have in Ireland, which is a big mark of what we perceive as our own success story. So, yeah, I mean, you know, you referred to export of floppy disks and CDs or DVDs in the past. That's become, and I think in economic terms, this is an improvement. Instead of exporting physical products like that, we're now exporting skills, whether it's in engineering, IT, or our construction abilities and capabilities. And it's not just Kirby, obviously. There's lots of our fellow construction companies are doing the same thing, and consultants and designers and all the rest of it.
And you know, I think that it's not just the data center. The reason that Ireland, or part of the reason why Ireland is so successful at data centers, actually is because we had Intel, and we had Pfizer, and we had IBM, and we had, before that, we had, you know, other disciplines of clean rooms, etc. Is that this is a growing marketplace. I showed this slide earlier. 30 billion capital spend per quarter is what's being spent right now. Ireland is about 1%. Would that be fair and reasonable, Dave? We're sort of 1% of the market globally.
Yeah, that's about right. Yeah.
But I would suggest that in Europe, Irish companies are working on 5%. So, you know, even, you know, it's all about context. And I think that's what this discussion helps with. It's about context. It's not like Ireland is the only place that these data centers can be. We're working hard. We have worked hard for 60 years to be, whether it's policies, our pedigree, our people, our power, our pipes, and now proximity and our skills is actually something that, if you look at some other geographic locations that maybe have more renewable energy than they need, they're subventing their energy. They're giving government grants for these big consumers to come and take it. Because again, what they don't want to do, and I'm so strong about this, they don't want to export all that energy at wholesale prices when they know they can take it as an input stock to a data and export it as an end product. Dave, you've often talked about this. There's 10 times multiple on a green photon than a green electron, right?
It took me a while to get my head around that concept that you introduced to me, Gary, but we did crunch the numbers on it. And in terms of the money spent on buying electricity and the 80 billion exports, I think at the time it was 71 billion, we got a multiplier of, I think, 400 to 1. So you could export an electron, or you could turn it into your photon and your data. And that industry was worth 400 times that the electricity cost. It's a bit of a strange comparison, but even if you were getting 10% of that, you'd still have a 40 or 50 to 1 upgrade on your electron value.
And that's a really interesting discussion, right? That's a really interesting discussion, because we've a 7 times, let's have this discussion now. We've a 7 times more sea mass than land mass. We can generate 75,000 megawatts, I understand. These interconnects, let's say between the north and south and all the rest, they're difficult, they're expensive. We'll have 2 gigawatts. We have 2 gigawatts of data centers, and we've got, let's say, 6 gigawatts of people, all the rest. So we have an 8 gigawatt opportunity, or 10. What do we do with the other 65 gigawatts of potential? To me, if it was gold, if it was diamonds, back in the day, if it was oil, we'd be looking at ways, how do we harness that to our benefit, to export? And data centers, where we're sitting, to Alan's point, we have earned the right through 6 decades of our relationship with data to be a tier 1 location. We've earned the right to go for it. Notwithstanding, and Dave, you and I have had this discussion, and Alan, you and I have, data works at 100 miles an hour. Electricity and the grids and stuff are starting now with smart grids to come up and change. Of course there's change. Of course there's going to be challenges. Of course there's going to be congestion and all this. But is that not the beauty of the world that we live in? That we want to be part of that pioneering best networks. I just think it's an opportunity to try and understand how we can even tap into 2 more gigawatts of that 70 that's out there.
On that note, Gary, just picking up on, we're getting some Q&A coming in on the forum here. Timely question here from an anonymous attendee. Are there policies and practices that you've seen from other countries that work in terms of incentivizing location outside major urban centres that should be considered here? Greater spread of data centres outside would help relieve grid constraints and broaden the recognition of the scale of the sector.
The greatest challenge that Ireland has right now is that we are, okay, let me start again. Proximity is a word that people should get comfortable with, right? Proximity, there are going to be data centers all over the world, from the top of every single traffic control system to what they call the edge, which is more like in a street, to every municipality, to every country, to the core. So you can imagine like a Russian doll with, you know, there'll be data centers of all sizes, including this thing. Well, you can't see it because of a green screen, but that's, I'm holding up a computer. That's a data center, right? Ireland's product is proximity to each other. 2 things. They need to be within 60 for their proximity zones. And the second thing, and most important thing, and this is part of the challenge we constantly have, the majority of our exports, if you get the whole point of a product is in the data center, is going to Europe, not going to America, not going down to the geographic areas. And there's been a lot of talk about the West and all the rest of it. It doesn't work right now for the product that we are exporting, particularly when you bear in mind that an electron is the same price in Dublin as it is in those geographic areas, and yet you're increasing the risk, moving further away from the fiber networks, and you're also going to geographic areas that potentially don't have the skills and services. So to answer the question of the person on there, our product will see a greater expansion of the geographic Greater Dublin area. There is no current desire with our product or incentives, and this is a key thing. There are no incentives to bring data centers to Ireland. None. Bar our 12.5% corporation tax. Because I get that in my company. Dave, you get that with your company. Unlike other geographic areas who are going for what's called glacial data. Glacial data, and this is again, we're maybe getting too technical, but it's data that you may or may not use for 3 to 5 years. It's data that may be only used for cryptocurrencies. It's data that maybe is billions of pictures of cats running up and down walls. Glacial data can go anywhere, and you want to go somewhere where your energy is really cheap. No question. Cryptocurrencies and stuff. High performance. The Greater Dublin area is our product, is proximity to each other. So therefore, yes to the question, there are incentives. Go to North America and you've got Portland, Oregon, you've got Quincy, they give away the energy. Europe, go up to the Nordics, they give subvention and stuff because they want basically the centers, as we said earlier, to take the green electron, to turn to data to export. Will we get a massive outflux of the data from the Dublin Metro? I think Dave has already shown, yes, we're going to get it outside the Dublin T50, but it's Dundalk, it's Wicklow, it's Kildare, it's Meath.
East Coast still.
East Coast, oh yeah, East Coast. And now what we're finding, Alan, is even with the announcements of the fast tracking of the offshore, 3,500 megawatts of the 7 offshore.
Yeah.
You know, that dynamic is again, and I don't know this for sure, but I can certainly say that somewhere along the line, somebody's going to need a corporate PPA to trigger that. And a data center dude that is looking 20, 25, 30 years is probably the guy who's going to want to take the offtake, which gives the financiers the gig to go and raise the money.
Yeah, there may well be an element of having to grasp the nettle here, because when we look around at other countries in Europe, the flaps, as Dave mentioned, in Frankfurt, London, Amsterdam, Paris, Stockholm, they have very similar problems with congestion as Dublin. So whatever way you read into it, it does suggest that it's not an intransigence around moving somewhere else or moving out of the urban centre. There is a genuine need there.
To do with the data, Alan, it's not to do with the centre. I think what threw a lot of people, and it's a very fair and reasonable question by the attendee on the call, is they look at Apple and they say, oh, Apple went to Athenry. Well, Apple are not a hyperscale in the truest hyperscale platform basis. They hold their own products. You know, there's no Netflix inside an Apple. There's no Uber inside an Apple. There's no of those other, like we were saying earlier, these are platforms. Amazon, Google, Microsoft are platforms. Facebook even is sort of a platform with some of their products, but Apple know their own products. They're designing, building, and operating for their own consumption, their own product. They went to Athenry, and that's what they do. They did the same in North America. The challenge that they had was they set an unrealistic precedent for those that follow afterwards, because they're up at just near the hyperscale level. The other guys are already established. You know, Amazon, Google, Microsoft have their proximity zones. It's hard to get them to go down there. They don't have really any desire, as far as I know. And then who are you waiting for? You're looking at the APAC, Tencent, Baidu, Alibaba. So, yeah, I'd say the Greater Dublin Metro, as I call it, is likely to see significant growth. Unless you heavily subsidize the energy, which I don't think we want to as a nation. I don't think anyway. It'll be hard to get a big one anywhere. You know, Cork is obvious, isn't it? Cork has a brand new transatlantic cable. It's a hard sell. Hard sell.
Guys, just being conscious of time, we might finish off with one or two more questions.
I'll just bounce down through. I'll pick out some random ones. There's a short one, so that's maybe it's a short answer as well. From Seamus, could Gary please expand on the idea of data centers moving to the cloud and the implications for data centers in Ireland?
It's the same thing. I was actually being facetious. The data center is the cloud. The cloud is the data center. It's the physical manifestation of the cloud. What you've got is you've got a data center. Well, there's two words in data center. One is the center. It's the physical box. It's the mechanical, electrical, and it's the box that sits and takes in. Inside that, you've got racks of servers. And inside those servers, you've got software. The software is the cloud. It's the, it's the storage. It's Dropbox. It's Netflix. It's Airbnb. So sorry, I may have confused people. I was being facetious when policymakers say we're worried about data centers going to the cloud, when in actual fact they're saying the one and the same thing.
Another one here from my old friend and colleague Mark Needham. Question to Dave and Gary: what 3 changes do you want to see in the wholesale electricity markets between now and 2030? He's added a comment. He loves the use of megawatts as opposed to MVA. Data centers can be more than demand centers, perhaps. They can provide services to the electricity system. I'll declare an interest. I'm currently looking at the vision for the markets in 2030. So this concept of data centers being more than just demand centers and offering services and other things in return.
I think it's a great question, right? And it's a strange one, this, because I can't see the people we're talking to. But 2 years ago, there was an awful lot of talk out there. Why aren't data centers in Ireland doing this, that, and the other? And one of the big things to your question, person who asked the question, things, why aren't they participating more in district heating systems? Why aren't they taking the excess heat? Why aren't they? And we just, we said, well, what district heating systems? What district heating systems? Because there's the same people in Denmark and in the Nordics are participating in district heating. So when the prototype that's going out in Tala kicked off, Amazon, I think, are participating in that district heating. So I don't think that there's ever any resistance. If they're doing it somewhere else, they can do it here. I mean, there's no fundamental difference. To answer the question directly, and Dave, you jump in, I'm doing all the talking, but I think for me, being able to connect and be proud of it, by the way. I think we're always we're not maybe as proud as we should be. I read things like the biggest onshore percentage in the world, would that be right? Is Ireland? For wind?
Yeah.
By statistic?
Yeah.
It's hard to find that out.
We should, I think.
But you have to dig hard to find that out, that by percentage we're the biggest, I think, in the world, right? Okay, Denmark's got offshore.
Denmark last year sometime, yeah. I suppose to go back to the earlier part of the question, 3 things, I don't know how I got 3 of them, but that I would do to the wholesale electricity market. I suppose number 1 would be I'd try and understand it a bit better, because it's highly, highly complex. One of the first things that's always struck me is power purchase agreements are so opaque. You can't really tell. You can pay extra for a guarantee of origin, but it's not that straightforward. It's not as clear cut. So it'd be nice if we had a better guarantee of origin type system, something that was a little bit more that you could fall back on, and that the corporates could say, I trust that we're actually getting credit for that renewable, and they're not getting kicked for it. The other piece I would talk about, maybe something more on variable pricing, feeding back into your point about grid services. Things like fast frequency response that data centers could implement to help more renewables come on stream. Are the financial incentives correct? I don't know. Are there things can be done in the longer term for that? With a trajectory to 70% renewables by 2030, and as Gary brought up, it could be 700% renewables, and what do we do with it? So can we find ways to encourage that to be absorbed? And I suppose a third one, if I was to nitpick, electricity users pay, but industrial electricity users pay a lot of charges based on the maximum import capacity that they design to. So, but they tend not to use that. So that, particularly for the smaller data centers, I've found that tends to be a problem. And if you look to markets like Germany, for instance, they book their MIC for next month and they work off that, as opposed to locking in the next 5 years, which is sort of what you have to do. I'm aware that EirGrid are getting much more open to, instead of forcing you, locking you into 3 steps, they're sort of saying maybe we can allow you 15 steps towards getting your firm MIC connection. But they'd be my 2.5 things that I would look at.
2.5 things. I like it. Alan, are you drinking gin and tonic?
No, did you not get the Host in Ireland glass, Gary?
I'm on the Pepsi.
And the Host in Ireland dark shirt. I know we're on the dark shirts tonight.
But Alan, you work on the different side. Obviously, to me, I work on the industry. You work in it, and that the whole idea and this 30% that Dave even mentioned earlier, and there were some misguided and unfortunate reports last year throwing out all sorts of numbers, and 30% seem to consume data centers will be 30%. When does that become an issue if it's not taken from other applications? I mean, if it was 30% and the people were starving, or they had, they couldn't cook their meals, or if cars and EVs and stuff couldn't be implemented, then it would be an issue. But it's never in that context. It's just the number, and then people walk away and say, oh yeah, 30%. But if it's value, and that 30% is turning, as Dave said, to more value, is that the discussion that maybe is not as well known, do you think?
Yeah, I think maybe the negative connotation is subconscious there. I think when Joe Public hears the 30% of electricity demand, and also hears that, demand on the electricity system is a problem. It potentially costs the electricity users a lot of money, etc., etc. Then subconsciously in their mind, they're connecting the fact that they don't know. Back to my first question, I guess, there isn't, I believe, there isn't a general perception in the public domain that data centers really have anything much to contribute. There might be a kind of a neutral to slightly negative perception there, that it does need to be worked on, where the public kind of goes, well, I don't know much about them. They're big grey boxes. I've heard about them. I've heard talk about them on the radio, and certain coverage in recent times hasn't been positive, to say the least. So I think as an industry, those who work on and in the industry, need to watch out for that. I've worked in other industries in the past whereby, attitudes, perceptions have crept up like that. Probably in many ways, incorrect or unfair perceptions, and it has been to the detriment of those industries. They've had to go at least on pause for a while they kind of regrouped and came back again. So it's just one to watch out for. I think it's definitely I'd have some concern about it.
Thanks very much for an excellent presentation, guys. I'd now like to invite John Ging to propose a vote of thanks.
Hi folks, I'm John Ging from the IET Ireland Network Committee, and I'm also the head of the near-time operations team at EirGrid, so I have a particular interest in tonight's talk. I'd like to propose a formal vote of thanks for Gary, Dave and Alan for a very informative session this evening. I've had the privilege of working with this trio, I suppose, over the last decade or so on various projects, and I'm always left impressed by their integrity, excellence and teamwork, which coincidentally is the IET's core values, and mainly the reason why we invited them along this evening. I was going to say something clever and smart, that we were lucky to have this incredible presentation from the SMART team, but Gary did steal my thunder by saying that everything SMART has a data center behind it. And as far as I can see...
I said the smart ass. I was told that once during the presentation.
That's even better. But as far as I can see, Gary only has Dennis Gary behind him, and the two lads have the Cosmos, I think it's the Cosmos anyway, and a pair of lamps behind them. So I don't know, go figure. So one thing that is very obvious though from tonight's talk is that these guys are fantastic advocates for encouraging further essential development of our greatest resources. It was great to hear about Ireland's location as a fibre hub on the outskirts of Europe has facilitated a revolution into the largest exporter through our digital factories. I'd like you to all put your hands, or your virtual hands, together as a mark of thanks and appreciation for the guys and their insights here tonight. Or I think there's a raise hand or something facility in Zoom. I can't remember exactly what it is, but just to mark that the guys have given us a very, very good insight tonight. So thanks very much.
Thank you, John. Thank you.
Actually, one thing before I go. Yesterday was International Bee Day, and I was very disappointed that Gary didn't mention the old DCs for Bees, which is a great initiative that the guys have been doing for the last year or two in trying to support the bee population. And if you get a chance, do Google the comic graphic of Gary dressed as a bee. It's all over LinkedIn anyway. It's well worth checking out.
You're so good, John. Thank you so much.
Thanks go to Gary, Dave, Alan and all who were involved in making this such an excellent presentation. I hope you can make it to our next one, and you can check our website for details. Thank you.